Richard Prosser.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, Mr Speaker, here we are at the beginning of a process that should have been begun possibly years ago, certainly months ago. I think it's a bit ironic, a bit on the nose, to hear the Greens suddenly start to jump up and down and call for a commission of inquiry when that is exactly what New Zealand First did 3.5 months ago, Mr Speaker. In fact, going back through some notes over just this year alone, as long ago as April, New Zealand First was calling for serious measures to be taken to prevent illegal fish dumping. What we were calling for then was for increased surveillance on fishing boats, not simply on the decks of a few boats in a few certain areas, but on all commercial boats that were bringing in catch, and also, Mr Speaker, in the holds of those boats. Because it's one thing recording what comes on board a boat, it's quite another to turn a blind eye or not have any kind of surveillance possible at all down below decks where there is still sorting, where there is still high grading, where there is still dumping going on. Back in May, Mr Speaker, we repeated that call for New Zealand to move to a land-all-catch policy, as is followed by some other jurisdictions, notably Iceland, which has turned around its entire fishing industry from a very low-value industry to a very high-value industry by using some very sensible methods. Back in June, as I said, Mr Speaker, we called for a commission of inquiry because the quota management system is now 30 years old, and when it was first brought in, it was regarded as world-leading, and quite possibly back then it was. But the world has changed. We have moved on, we have developed, we have evolved certain fishing practices, certainly in the more civilised parts of the world where we like to count ourselves, Mr Speaker, and the Minister does deserve some credit for the Fisheries Amendment Act that went through a couple of years ago, where we moved to reflag foreign charter vessels from overseas flags to the New Zealand flag, so that we could impose upon the owners of those boats decent wages, decent living conditions, and the subjection of New Zealand labour laws to crews that were living in rat-like conditions and effectively operating as slave labour. So they do deserve credit for that, Mr Speaker, but there is a great deal more that they could have done and should have done, and it should really have started doing months ago when it was first suggested. Mr Speaker, the short answer is that the QMS, although it was meant to be a measure that addressed the issue of too many boats chasing too few fish and overfishing being rampant, because of the way that it has evolved over the last 30 years, it is actually now cause of some of the problems that this industry faces. So high grading, where fishers discard lesser quality fish in order to bring in as much better quality fish as they can within their quota allocation, happens because of the deemed value provisions of the QMS. And any catch that's brought in over quota is deemed to be of a given value that fishers must pay to MPI. And it's most frequently that it's more than what the fish can be sold for. So if a fisher brings in an extra tonne of snapper or an extra tonne of any variety that is over and above the quota that they hold, and they can't find somebody else who holds additional quota that they're willing to lease or sell them, they need to pay that value to MPI. It's meant to discourage overfishing, Mr Speaker, but in fact it is the cause of it. Fishers know that landing catch outside of their limits is going to cost them, so they dump it instead. The problem with that is the waste that it causes, because, and the Minister mentioned the precision seafood harvesting system, which is effectively a high-tech form of trawl net, and I acknowledge that it's a better system than what has been used in the past, but it has not had wide uptake yet. It is very much in a pioneering state, and it will take a while and a lot of investment before the industry begins to use that kind of technology as a standard. In the meantime, we still have people using traditional old methods to bring in enormous catches of fish. And when you pull a fish out of the water in a net, Mr Speaker, it's dead anyway. If you have careful handling of fish by people who know what they're doing, they can return undamaged fish to the sea in a state that they remain alive. But the practical upshot of commercial fishing is that there is neither time nor the methods available in order for that to happen, so it just doesn't. And there is allowance. There is an allowance within the total allowable commercial catch for what is called discard. It's a given quantity of fish that it is deemed acceptable for the industry to dump overboard for various reasons, Mr Speaker. The problem is exacerbated by the market side of the fishing industry, where fish buyers specify what they want to fishers and to quota holders in terms of size and species, and they either will not take or they will pay very little for anything that falls outside those parameters. And our solution, Mr Speaker, is to adopt the Icelandic system of land-all-catch, where all fish that is caught must be landed and must be processed, whether it's undersized or over quota or non-target species or whatever. Any fish that the fisher doesn't have the appropriate licence or quota for in the Icelandic system is then sold at auction, and the proceeds from those auctions go back into the industry, they go back into fisheries management, they go back into fisheries research, they go back into fisheries policing. And this incentivises fishers to more accurately target their desired quota species, and the penalty for missing that target being that they don't make as much money as they could, rather than actually losing it by having to pay MPI a deemed value for fish that is not worth what they're being charged. So it also means that under that system, the fish buyers do not get to dictate the market, Mr. Speaker. One of the things about a consumer economy is that retailers, wholesalers want to try and sell a particular product to a given target market that they believe has a desire for it. When we're dealing with a wild resource, sometimes that is just simply not sustainable, Mr. Speaker. So with a land all catch policy, the power to distort the state of the fishery itself is taken away from fish buyers. It results in a market that is much more honest, that is much more traditional, and that is much more sustainable. The issue that we have with the results of the investigation released this week is that while the Ministry was using its cameras to look for unintended dolphin bycatch as a result of incorrect fishing practices, what they also discovered was illegal dumping, which they chose not to prosecute on the grounds that this would discourage future cooperation from fishers. Well, Mr. Speaker, as we've heard from the Minister, that may have been able to be partially justified in one case, but certainly was not at all justified in the other. And we're not yet confident that heads have rolled in a sufficient number in the right places. And in actual fact, it's something I think the Minister could do with taking a good hard look at himself over, Mr. Speaker. We say that New Zealand as a society allows commercial fishers quota access to the fishery, which is a commons property that belongs to all of us, at no cost, but within rules and guidelines, and that fishers have to remain within those rules and guidelines or get out of the fishery. We've created quota access to the fishery as a tradable property right and gifted it to the industry. And it might be that that was a mistake, but that was 30 years ago and that was the decision that was taken then, Mr. Speaker. The solution may be to renationalise the fishery and move to a licensing system, as is operated in some other parts of the world, or it may not. And the potential fishhook in that, no pun intended, Mr. Speaker, is that commercial fishers do have a right to make an honest living, and they do need some surety of access to the fishery in order to justify their continued investment and presence in it. So any licensing system that we brought in would have to be more than simply a lottery. And these are the sorts of questions that need to be asked and answered by a commission of inquiry, which is why we keep calling for one, Mr. Speaker. It's all well and good for the Minister to say they're having another internal review. The time for internal reviews is over. We need a full commission of inquiry into the totality of fisheries management in New Zealand, recreational and commercial, starting at the top, working all the way through. 30 years on from the beginning of the QMS, it is time for this to be completely reinvestigated, Mr. Speaker, and I am glad that we have got this opportunity to debate it this afternoon. I'm disappointed that we have the likes of the Greens jumping on the bandwagon. It's good that people are backing our call for a commission of inquiry. Trying to claim credit for it themselves is a bit on the nose. Mr. Speaker, if we don't move to a more sustainable system for managing our fishery, we will have no fishery left in very short order. Thank you very much.